It's a real pleasure to be here today and to see so many people come out on a beautiful sunny summer afternoon to hear about a really morbid and depressing topic. So welcome, and I hope at the end of this you'll realize a little bit more about how planet Earth is working. So Judy gave me a very brief introduction. I'm an oceanographer, really. Oceanography is divided up into different scientific disciplines. My background is earth science or geology, but I'm going to talk mainly about biology today because they're interrelated. A bit about my background. I was born in Bangor and raised in Bangor and Surrey. And after graduating from Bangor High School, I went across the border to New Hampshire for college. And then between my junior and senior year at college, I worked at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution for 6 months. 5 of those months were at sea. I don't recommend that to anyone, spending 5 straight months at sea, but it lit the torch for me to enter the field of oceanography. So after that, I went down to New York for graduate school, and then the lure of the Antipodes struck, and I went to Australia for my first job in Canberra, stayed there for 5 years. And then I bounced back to the United States, to the University of Texas at Austin, for nearly a dozen years. And then the Orient beckoned, and I took a job at the University of Tokyo for 7 years. Bouncing around a bit more, I went to the United Kingdom for 3 years at the National Oceanography Center. And then I did the boomerang back to Australia in 2011, and I've been in Tasmania ever since. And this just represents, with a Ph.D. in oceanography, it's not like being a doctor or a lawyer or something. You don't have to pass a board or an exam in every state. With a Ph.D. you can go anywhere, which is great if you like international flavor. I'm what's called a blue water oceanographer, so they're blue water and brown water oceanographers. Blue water oceanographers work in the deep sea, which is my specialty. Brown water oceanographers are coastal oceanographers. And I've been on 32 expeditions in the deep sea, and the film that I was just showing you from was my most recent expedition back in January and February, a 2-month voyage to a submarine plateau here, which is actually an interface between biology and earth science, which is fascinating. I might have a little time to answer questions about it at the end. So moving on to the topic at hand, today I'm going to talk about mass extinctions. And mass extinction definition is when greater than 75% of Earth's total estimated species become extinct in a geologically brief interval. Now I'll talk about geologically brief a little bit more, but the reason there's estimated species in front of species is because we don't really know how many species there are on Earth. Does anyone have a rough idea? Extremely rough idea?
A lot.
I mean, we're supposed to be the smartest things on planet Earth. We should know these things. Does anyone have a clue?
100,000.
A billion.
Well, I'm hearing all kinds of numbers. And the fact of the matter is we don't know.
That's where we were.
So the best estimate published recently is 8.7 million plus or minus 1.3 million. And of those, about a quarter of those live in the ocean, but the vast majority of those haven't been described at all, so we know essentially nothing about them. But I'll put a caveat here at the bottom. Those in the back can't see it, but for this estimate of 8.7 million, the authors assumed that there were only 10,000 species of microbes, bacteria and viruses. A more recent study, published a few years after that, estimates that there's 10 to the 12th, and that's a trillion bacteria and virus species. So we really don't know what's living on this planet, is the bottom line. So that's a caveat for the rest of my talk, is because a mass extinction is defined as greater than 75% of estimated species. So everything is an estimate as we move backward in time. So as a geologist, I work in geologic time, and the Earth, everyone knows, is 4.5 billion years old, but it's really hard for people to grasp this concept of geological time. We tend to think of grandparents to grandkids in our normal lives, and that's about 250 years. It's been getting better with time, but it's still only about 250 years. And I'm going to be talking today mostly about millions of years. So I'm going to show you a few slides to try and give you a better concept of geological time. So this is a wheel that essentially shows the entire 4.5 billion years of Earth history proceeding in this direction clockwise. And I'll just point out a few highlights in the evolution of our planet to give you a sense of when things happened. So about 4 billion years ago is the first signs of life. So life appeared relatively soon, geologically, after the planet formed. And then the first photosynthesis came along just 500 million years later. I say just, because that's how geologists talk. So oxygen is being produced by these life forms 3.5 billion years ago. But it took a long, long time for life to evolve. The atmosphere really didn't become oxygen rich until 2.3 billion years ago. So there was several billion, or over 1 billion years after photosynthesis started, that there really wasn't a lot of oxygen around for things like us or anything resembling us to consume. Between 750 and 635 million years ago, there were two very dramatic episodes in Earth history. We call them snowball Earths. It's essentially the whole Earth froze over. Hard to imagine. And then the heat coming out of the center of the Earth eventually caused that snowball to melt, and we have a planet more or less like we see it today. But those are very dramatic events, but those happened actually before life really blossomed on Earth in a big way, multicellular life. So what we call the Cambrian explosion is the time when all this multicellular life suddenly appears in the geological record. And that was about 530 million years ago. So only in the last ninth, or 10% of Earth history, do you actually see a lot of life on the planet that's been preserved in the fossil record. And then the dinosaurs came along 230 million years ago, and they ruled the Earth for 165 million years. Pretty smart, huh? They were pretty clever beasts to stay around for that long. Homo sapiens have been around for about 200,000 years, and we think we're clever. Will we last 165 million years? Chances are not looking good. So 2 million years ago, the first hominids appeared, the first things that looked anything like us. And then, as I said, our species came around about 200,000 years ago. So when we think about the history of the planet, in the 1800s, there was a raging debate as to what really were the processes that determined how the planet evolved. Was it kind of very uniform processes like we see out here, for example, the waves hitting the shore? Sometimes there's a big storm and a rock will hit another rock and they'll break up. And is that the sort of process that dominates Earth history? Or is it more sort of a huge catastrophic event like an asteroid hitting the planet? And this was played out between two scientists from different countries. There was Georges Cuvier from France, who believed in this catastrophic history of Earth, that things happen very dramatically, but very rarely. And then there was Charles Lyell, who followed him and actually started attacking Cuvier after he died. He conveniently waited. But it's one of the few examples probably in history where the French have actually beaten the English, and Cuvier's catastrophism beat the uniformitarianism idea. So this is a summary from a British stratigrapher just saying catastrophism, or at least episodicity, is apparent in everything from storm deposits to evolution, from plate tectonics to volcanism, from earthquakes to extraterrestrial impacts. Perhaps a briefer way of saying this, summarized by the same author, is the whole history of Earth is one of short, sudden happenings with nothing much happening in between. Or a more succinct, perhaps the most succinct way, is long periods of boredom separated by short periods of terror. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is terror. So mass extinctions are terrorist events in Earth history. Unfortunately, the last one happened 65 million years ago, so they're quite removed from where we are today. So these are the big 5 mass extinctions. This is geological time along the bottom, going from 550 million years ago to present, to the right across the screen. And this is extinctions at the genus level, plotted on the vertical axis. And these are the big 5. So geologists come up with funny names. The easiest one to determine here is Devonian. So that's named after, because there's a particularly thick sequence of rocks in Devon in England that contain many fossils. This part of geologic time has been named the Devonian. And the same is true of the Ordovician, Permian, Triassic, Cretaceous. They're all named for specific features in the geological record. So in Ordovician time, 86% of estimated species went extinct in a fairly short time, and by short time I mean 500,000 to a million years. Devonian time, 359 million years ago, just barely made the cutoff, 75% estimated species went extinct. The mother of all extinctions is the Permian extinction. 96% of all species went extinct. That was 250 million years ago. And then there was a Triassic extinction. They'll show you a slide of a little later, 80%. Then the most recent one, when the dinosaurs disappeared, is the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction, when just 76% of species went extinct. So you can see there's not really a regularity in this, but there are some common factors in these extinctions. And if these ring a bell, it gives you some concern about the future. So in the 443 million year one, there were glacial, interglacial cycles like we're seeing now. Transgressions and regressions are when sea level changes, which we're going to see a bit of soon, and sequestration of carbon dioxide. Devonian one, you see some of the same things, global cooling, warming, the oceans becoming anoxic, potentially a meteorite, but we don't really have that nailed down. In this Permian one, again, changes in the global climate, oceans becoming anoxic, a lot of hydrogen sulfide going into the system, carbon dioxide, acidification of the oceans, and volcanism. And this is where I got interested in this problem, is because I work on submarine volcanoes. 200 million years ago, again, many similar things, and then the Cretaceous Tertiary one. So in this slide, I just summarized what these common sort of features are of each of these mass extinctions. So the Earth was undergoing these changes when the mass extinctions happened. So their correlation doesn't necessarily mean there's a causal relationship, but it's highly suspicious that these had something to do with the mass extinctions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Cretaceous Tertiary one, 65 million years ago, which most people attribute to an asteroid or a bolide impacting the Earth. And there's a big crater in Mexico, in Yucatan, called Chicxulub, and that has been drilled recently, scientifically drilled, and they've come back with, when they're able to date the age of the rocks very precisely. The impact was 65 million years ago. They estimate that it was a extraterrestrial body that was 10 kilometers in diameter, and it impacted at 20 kilometers per second, so rather fast. It dug a hole 30 kilometers deep, or about 20 miles deep, and 100 kilometers, or about 60 miles in diameter. So that instantaneous event is what most people would say caused the mass extinction 65 million years ago. But at the same time, there was a lot of volcanic activity in India, in the Deccan Traps in western India. So that's also sort of a contributing factor on this. But I'll just go through what happened with that impact to give you an idea of the changes the Earth experienced when this impact happened. So the bolide was going so fast that it essentially vaporized the entire ocean. The ocean was it was shallow, it was on the continental shelf, so it was only a couple hundred meters deep, 200 yards deep. And the impact actually caused ejecta to go up into space, and some of it actually escaped the Earth's atmosphere and has probably wound up on the moon. So it was a very energetic impact. You wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere near it. It caused earthquakes and tsunamis. You can imagine 20 or 15 miles in diameter hitting the ocean. It's going to cause a huge wave. So it kind of makes the Japanese tsunami or the Indian Ocean tsunami 10 years ago look like child's play. And it would also cause the Earth to ring like a bell, which would set off earthquakes. Because the atmosphere was so disrupted by this big body hurtling through it, it would cause something called hypercanes, which is a scaled-up version of a hurricane. And again, hundreds of miles per hour winds, and these sort of traversing around the Earth. All that ejecta, when the thing hit the ground, it heated up the rocks immensely. Those went out, fell down, caused vegetation to burn. So in the geologic record, there's an ash layer of global wildfires caused by this impact event. And then, because it's threw all this stuff into the atmosphere, it essentially blocked the sun. So there was less radiation coming in, so the Earth actually cooled for several years after this. So what we call a cosmic or nuclear winter happened. So most photosynthetic organisms probably didn't like that very much. They couldn't photosynthesize during the summer months. So there was a global cooling event associated with this impact. And then following this cosmic winter, because the ozone layer was destroyed by this body, there was an ultraviolet spring. So there's intense radiation coming through that we don't experience now because we have ozone up there that's blocking it. So that caused mutations and deaths to some species, presumably. So the next time you think you're having a hard day at work, remember 65 million years ago, and you will be chastened to no longer think you're having such a bad day. I threw this slide in. This is a picture of Hobart's Harbor in Tasmania, and it just, to me, this looked like this mountain was erupting. And it was erupting. It was just erupting 200 million years ago. It's associated with one of those mass extinctions. So I live right over here in Hobart, and so I look up at this mountain every day and I'm reminded that these flood basalts were associated with a mass extinction event. Well, you all know we have a lot of problems modeling climate today, and there's considerable debate over climate forecasting, let alone weather forecasting. Listen to NOAA weather radio, you're good 2 days out, but beyond that, pretty much. But we try to understand the mechanisms and processes that happen with these big volcanic eruptions, which are a common feature of 3 of the 5 mass extinctions and maybe more. So there's all kinds of things that happen. You put a lot of greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere along with a lot of ash. That blocks the sun, as I just said. It causes global cooling. There's a lot of atmospheric chemistry involved. It changes the chemistry of the atmosphere. You can have effects in the ocean. And so we try to understand all these feedback loops that are happening to try and get an understanding for what exactly is causing these mass extinction events. And it's complicated, in a word. I'd have much more confidence if we could predict the weather 5 days out, than if we could actually model climate 65 million years ago. So this mother of all extinctions, 250 million years ago, coincides with the largest volcanic activity that's been recorded on Earth. And that preceded the extinction. It began before the extinction happened. It continued through at a very high level, the extinction event. There was a lot of carbon dioxide that went into the atmosphere, a lot of sulfur dioxide, because this volcanism came up through a basin in Russia that had a lot of evaporites, and salt had formed in this basin, and that carries a lot of sulfur dioxide. So it's estimated that the global temperature warmed by probably 20 degrees Fahrenheit during and after this mass extinction. So a very sudden change in temperature, sudden geologically, so we're talking tens to hundreds of thousands of years, and that's a contributing factor to the extinction. I'm going to change gears a little bit here and talk a bit about processes, because people are looking at what we're doing to the planet today and coming up with ideas and how we're affecting the whole planet as a system. And they've come up with this concept of planetary boundary conditions or framework. And essentially you have a control variable along the horizontal axis and a response variable along this. So this could be greenhouse gases, a control variable on this axis. This could be global temperature on this. So it's generally thought that, yes, you proceed along, you can change the control variable to some degree, and it's in a safe operating space, which is in green. And then you get in some transition area where there are a lot of uncertainties about what will happen if you change that control variable, say greenhouse gases. And then you reach a new state after you push this control variable to a greater degree. And there may be a threshold in there, a tipping point that causes the Earth system to go into a very different state than before, and it's very hard to get back to the previous state. This may be a smooth curve, or it may have this sort of threshold in it, but that's how ecologists think about these sorts of problems. And this particular group of workers has come up with a number of control variables or environmental stressors, planetary boundaries that are labeled around this wheel. So a familiar one here is climate change, genetic diversity, biosphere integrity, land system changes, freshwater use, biochemical flows, this would be phosphorus, nitrogen, ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol, stratospheric ozone, and then something called novel entities. And this is like the big question mark that scientists use. A novel entity. It could be plastic in the ocean, for example. It could be all that plastic that's winding up in the ocean, breaks down, is being consumed by plankton on up, getting into our food chain, and that plastic loves to latch on to very toxic materials. So that is propagating through our food chain now, and it could be a novel entity, but we don't know yet because there's not enough work that's been done on it. So remember again that the green is the safe operating space, so the center of this wheel. The yellow is very uncertain, the red is the danger zone, and then these question marks, we just don't know enough about the effects. So the two real danger zones, one here on this, in their study, is genetic diversity. So the extinction rates of many life forms has increased very much in the last 500 years, thanks to us, thanks to humans. And then our green revolution, our agriculture, our fertilizing many parts of the globe, which is pumping so much phosphorus and nitrogen in the system that it's overwhelming the natural system. And that's why we have these huge toxic algae blooms in the Gulf of Mexico. 2008 Olympics in China, the sailing Olympics were in Qingdao, and they were mopping up algae this thick to try so they could get the sailboats through to race. So we are causing that problem a big time. But then, of course, there's more than 7 billion of us, so we need to be fed. So, but this phosphorus and nitrogen is a real danger zone parameter. Ocean acidification is something that we think a lot about as oceanographers. 100 years ago, this was the concentration or saturation state in the ocean of aragonite, which is a form of calcium carbonate. Now it's at about 400, and you can see the safe zone is constricting towards the equator. The polar regions are sort of more in the uncertain zone. And as we put more and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the ocean becomes more and more acidic, or less basic. Actually, the ocean's not acidic to begin with. So it becomes less basic, but it's more toxic to aragonite. It dissolves it much easier. So as we reach these higher levels, and this is what it's predicted to be by the turn of the century, we have a lot of critical areas that little plankton that make their homes out of calcium carbonate won't be able to build their homes anymore because they'll dissolve before they can build them. The ocean is a complicated place, as everyone in this building I know, in this lab knows. I just thought this sort of colonic diagram would show what these environmental stressors are and how they're all linked together. Everything, salinity, simple things, carbon dioxide, areas where there's less oxygen, trophic cascades, so if you affect one predator, for example, eliminate that predator, you get a lot of something else that now is no longer being preyed upon, ultraviolet light, nutrients. So all of these things play a role in determining the health of the ocean ecosystem. And we, as humans, are affecting many of these directly. So this is the one that I talked about as being really in the danger zone now, this phosphorus nitrogen system here. So the red, again, is the danger zone, and you see that around the Great Lakes region, a lot of wheat farming, for example, that's a danger area. China is pretty much, the whole country is a danger area because they have so many people in such a small space. So agriculture is really important. Nitrogen, similar story. Land system changes, the most densely populated parts of the equatorial regions are real in danger. And then freshwater usage, we know that's a problem in a lot of equatorial Asia, low latitude Asia. So if you can go through all of these environmental stressors and identify which ones were sort of still in the safe zone, which ones are in the zone of uncertainty, and which ones are really in the danger zone. And then if you put them all together and put biospheric integrity, or the health of our planet as an ecosystem, in the center, we get all these sorts of feedback loops. So the strong red lines indicate that there's a really strong connection between those two. If you change climate, then you're really going to affect biospheric integrity. If you change atmospheric loading, probably there's a much weaker effect. But for each of these authors, led by Will Stephan at the Australian National University, have identified these environmental stressors. So now I'm going to turn to sort of the geological record and what we've observed in the past extinction events in terms of rates, how fast do things become extinct, and compare that with the present day. And it's not a pretty story. So ecologists think of extinction rates in these sort of terms: extinctions per 1,000 species per 1,000 years, or extinctions per million species per million years. So that's the rate that's shown on the vertical axis. And then along the bottom here, we have different types of animal life. So in the distant geological past, this is sort of the extinction rate we saw, somewhere between 0.1 and 1 extinction per 1,000 species per 1,000 years. Well, in the recent past, and this recent past is the last 500 years, we've seen a 10 to 100 times increase in the extinction rate over this sort of background level. And if we project this into the future, it looks even worse. So again, a 10 or 100 times worse rate of extinction. And this is pretty well documented from the geological record for the past and then what's happening today, studies by ecologists. And if you want to read more about this, the popular press and the scientific press, this is a paper that came out in 2011 in Nature, a well-regarded scientific journal. It was a provocative question: has the Earth's sixth mass extinction already arrived? I went to a talk that this lead author, Anthony Barnowski, gave at a professional conference 5 years ago. It was the first morning of a 5-day conference in San Francisco at the Moscone Center. And I was sitting with a colleague, former colleague from the University of Texas. And during the talk, I mean, it was a really depressing talk for the start of the meeting, we kept looking at each other saying, wow, I had no idea the Earth was in such bad shape. And everyone who walked out of that, there were probably 150 people at this talk, we just walked out with this. It's like, what a way to start a meeting, just to hear this bad news about what we as humans are doing for the planet. More popular press, Elizabeth Colbert, a New Yorker writer and author, has written this book called The Sixth Extinction, where she goes through in a popular science sort of way, describing what we're doing to the planet and how it does appear that we're progressing. We're well on the way to a sixth mass extinction event. So that won the Pulitzer Prize, so it's been a bestseller. Turning to the present day, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, has a red list of threatened species. And going down through those rows: extinct, extinct in the wild, critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, least concern, no data, or not evaluated. So again, uncertainty among scientists, we just say we don't know, or most people say they don't know, unlike some politicians. So I'm going to use this term threatened quite a bit, and threatened includes critically endangered and vulnerable. So these three categories here in the next few slides. So remember that. So it's three categories when I use the word threatened. I don't want you to be overwhelmed by these graphs, but they are illuminating. I'll try to explain them as best I can. So this particular figure shows various types of life on this axis, and then percent or extinction magnitude on this. So this is the 75% cutoff for a mass extinction event. And these are the 5 big mass extinctions over here that I described earlier. So at the present day, this is where we are right now, species that have gone extinct in each of these, in this particular study. If all the threatened species become extinct, then this is where we are. And it's not looking very good for those threatened species, because human population is increasing, putting increasing pressure on ecosystems globally. So again, if all the threatened species become extinct in the next 100 years, this is where we are. And so we're getting up to 10, 20, 30, 60% extinction of these various life forms, various families. So we are getting kind of close if you do the projection. A slightly different way to look at this is this. So this is the extinction rate over here. In this case, it's extinction per million species per year. And this is, 75% cutoff here. So for the big 5 mass extinctions, it looks like this was sort of the range of extinction rates. So somewhere between 0.01 and 10 extinctions per million years per species. This is where we are now with species. This is where we are with the threatened species, and this is sort of the trend. So you can already see, for at least this Cretaceous one, because of the boli, was much more sudden. So the extinction rate was probably really quick then. But for these other 4 mass extinction events, the extinction rate all appears to be lower than what we're experiencing currently on Earth. Again, that's pretty sobering. So these authors did a calculation. So if over the next 100 years, all of those threatened, and again, that's 3 categories, if all those threatened species become extinct, then we only have 240 to 540 years until we reach 75% of estimated species are gone from Earth. If only the critically endangered species become extinct, we've got a bit longer, 1,000 to 2,000 years. So that's pretty scary. The Earth would look quite different with 75% of our species gone. Another way to look at that is, well, how much faster are things becoming extinct now than they were, say, more than 100 years ago? And the answer that these authors came up with is it's more than 100 times faster. So if we look at various families of vertebrates, birds, mammals, other vertebrates through time, highly conservative view is this. This is cumulative extinctions, and this is time on this axis. We see that sort of playing out. This is the conservative estimate here, and you can see they're not really that much different. So again, not a very optimistic picture. So this is to show you if extinction had been happening at a normal background rate. Comparing that with what we've observed for the past 114 years. So amphibians are particularly vulnerable. So if we'd only had a background extinction rate of amphibians over the last 100 years, well, in recent times, it would take 10,000 years for as many amphibians to become extinct as actually have become extinct. So we've really ramped up the extinction rate of amphibians, and you can see all these other things. So 114 years, what's happened in that time period versus how long it would take at the normal extinction rate to predict the observed extinction. So it's 2,000 years, 6,000 years versus 114 years, which is what is observed now. Now, to sort of illustrate the stress that we're placing on the Earth's ecosystems, this is sort of a proxy for aggregated human pressure on the biosphere. So mean species abundance, and this is in sort of fractions of 1. So in the red areas, there's only, say, 10%, 10 to 20% or less of species numbers that were actually living there before we really arrived in mass. So you can see in the heavily populated, in the Midwest of the US, across most of Europe, China, India, some parts of South America, we've really reduced the number of species, and this is, of course, contributes to their extinction. The more you cut down on numbers, just look at the passenger pigeon, they can't come back. So that sort of shows you where the hotspots are, and they generally correlate with where we're living. So I'm just going to close up with a few very depressing quotes. So Bill McGuire, an environmental writer, says, instead of a world of gorillas, pandas, birds of paradise, and corals, our descendants will have to make do with rats, cockroaches, thistles, and nettles. And what this is getting at is that when we have extinction events, the most complex life forms are the ones that are most vulnerable, the ones with the longest gestation periods, the ones that have the most specialized niches, Those are the ones, and the cockroaches have been around through 3 mass extinction events and survived no problem. We are complicated. We have long gestation periods. I've given this talk quite a few times, including at TED, and I get this question is, well, what about us, humans? Are we going to be part of this mass extinction? Well, we're part of it because we're contributing to it, but will we become extinct? And I can just say, from the geological record, it is complex life forms that become extinct in general. Another pretty depressing quote. Biodiversity is such a fragile thing, tenderly and incrementally reared by evolution, that it may take 5 million years or more to restore itself. We're actually playing God with the evolution itself and the entire future prospects of life on Earth. And this just represents the impact 7 billion of us are having on the planet. We're pushing other species to extinction. And from the geological record, we know that it takes several million years for the Earth to bounce back with diverse life. And then Jonathan Franzen, the author, put this into one of his books. It's true that the most effective single action that most human beings can take, not only to combat climate change, but to preserve a world of biodiversity, is to not have children. And that's something we do have a lot of control over, but we can't seem to help ourselves. There is an imperative, a biological imperative, it seems, to reproduce ourselves in ever-increasing numbers. And this chart, which everyone is aware of, but just shows how our pressure has been increasing. So 1804, we passed the 1 billion mark in Earth's population. 1927, the 2 billion mark. Just 33 years later, 3 billion. Just 14 years later, 4 billion. Just 13 years later, 5 billion. Just 12 years later, 6 billion. 13 years later, 7 billion. Projected to go to 8 billion in just 8 years from now. And then 9 billion. And I think we're going to level out somewhere around 10 to 11 billion. So this is what's causing everything I just talked about. This pressure on the Earth's environment as a whole. So that is the end of my very sobering message, and I'm happy to take any questions and do the Café thing. Yes?
Why do you think it's going to level out at 11 billion?
Those are the best projections. I don't think we really know, but those are the projections I've read in the literature.
And you had mentioned something about India way in the very beginning, that was also happening at the same time as, was it the Cretaceous extinction? What was going on?
Okay, there's a question about what was happening at the Cretaceous Tertiary Extinction 65 million years ago, in addition to the impact of the asteroid with Earth. So at approximately the same time, the best guess is within a few tens of thousands of years, there was a massive eruption of lava in India called the Deccan Traps. And this persisted for several 100,000 years, but most of Western India is covered by these basalts, like Hawaii, like the island of Hawaii is composed of. And that happened at the same time, geologically, as the asteroid impact. So it could have been a double whammy. Both of those things happening at the same time could have contributed to the mass extinction event then. Yes?
The end Pleistocene with the big mammals, woolly mammoths, and, do you think man caused that, or just warming, or what?
The question is about the megafauna extinctions at the end of the Pleistocene, so 18,000 years ago roughly, or 20,000 years ago. I'm really not an expert on that, and I can't say, but the evidence I've heard about and read suggests that there was a strong relationship between the arrival of humans and the extinction of those large megafauna. It's true in Australia with some of the giant flightless birds, with the arrival of aborigines and dingoes. It's true in New Zealand for their flightless birds. So, yeah, I think we're most likely to be a contributing factor to their demises. Yes?
So, as the population expands and the water supply depletes, will that not cause some turbulence in the projections?
The question is about water supply and freshwater use, and as the population increases demand for freshwater, will that cause some turbulence in the system? That's a very good question. I think we're learning better how to conserve water through time, so I'm more optimistic that we'll find a solution to freshwater usage than I am about some of the other things like phosphorus and nitrogen. Yes?
You stated that the world's population is going to increase up to about 10 billion, and then it'll stop, taper off. Why should it?
I'm not a demographer, but I just have read papers on the subject, and I have to say that I'm not convinced that the modeling is really good, because I see error bars of 1 billion or 2 billion, plus or minus 1 or 2 billion. So those are the best projections I think that have reached a consensus on, so like the United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Report, but I don't have a lot of confidence in that. I think the general trend around the globe is the more you educate women, which is happening in most parts of the world, the fewer children they have, and that has been decreasing the birth rate through much of the Western world, that trend, and it seems to be happening now in Africa, and it's happening in Asia as well. So there are hopeful signs that the Earth's population might stabilize, but that leads to a whole another set of questions, because capitalism is based on growth, and is our economic system really amenable to a steady state population? Every politician you say, oh, we've got to increase the population here. We've got to have 2 million people in Maine instead of 1.3 million. We've got to have more jobs. And well, the only way to do that is if there are more people on the planet to buy more stuff. So is our economic system tailored right now to a steady state population or even a decreasing population? We can look to Japan. So Japan's population is currently 125 million people, and it's projected at the end of the century to be down to about 70 or 65 million people. We've seen Japan's economy is stagnant since 1990, and the proportion of people over 65 is increasing ever more, and there are fewer and fewer people there to support the social welfare system. So Japan is probably the best test case as to whether a steady state or even a declining population is sustainable in our economic system. Yes, Marshall.
You mentioned at the very beginning something about changes in sea level. I was wondering if you could comment on the potential sea level changes, particularly as I'm thinking of that glacier in the Antarctic that is starting to slide and they say can't be stopped.
Yeah, actually the voyage I was showing you, which was in the Antarctic in January and February, we were kind of peripherally studying sort of whether the waters were warming. The colleagues of mine in Hobart have been looking at the temperature of water right around the continent, right around the ice edge, the ice shelves. And it's really worrisome. The water is warming quite quickly. It's eroding the base of the ice shelves, which are grounded. They're sitting on ground, so they're actually holding the continental glaciers from flowing into the sea. And it's estimated if they erode and the West Antarctic ice sheet suddenly is released into the ocean, the global sea level would rise by about 25 feet. And that would happen over a period. We don't really know how quickly it would happen, but some people say it could happen in 100 years. That's sort of the minimum. It could take 500 or 1,000 years, but that's the sort of thing we're talking about. If all of Greenland melted, ice melted, it's about the same, about 20, 25 feet. Yes?
If the Earth is roughly 25,000 miles around, and the thing that hit off of Mexico, or wherever it was only, let's say, like 9 miles across, that wouldn't even be a head of a pin to the Earth. How could it do such tremendous damage?
It's the energy. So E equals mc squared. So this thing is going at 20 kilometers per second, and so that hit. We have a magnitude scale for earthquakes. So magnitude 9 is about the biggest. It's a logarithmic scale from 1 to 9. 9 is the biggest one we've ever seen in recorded history, which is 100 years out of 4.5 billion years. So it's estimated that the impact of that would cause a magnitude 12 earthquake. And a magnitude 9 earthquake sets the earth ringing for days afterwards. So magnitude 12, which is 3 orders of magnitude bigger than a magnitude 9, would really disrupt the earth. And that, I mean, people have said, people who study the brain know that if you hit someone on one side of the head, the other side of the head is injured, and the Earth's kind of similar to that. If you hit one side, like Mexico, then the other side could really fracture and be damaged. And India, where these flood basalts came out, is more or less on the other side. So energy could have focused on the antipodes to the impact, and then cause fissures and cause, this has been speculation, that all this lava come out and contribute to the
So
causes.
what you're saying is the head of a pin hitting the earth did all that damage. Wow.
Well, another example is space dust. You know, when the space shuttle is up there, there's pieces of dust that have caused craters in the side of the space shuttle because there's so much, they're traveling so fast, there's so much energy in there. You know, it's mass times velocity squared is the, so, yeah. Highly energetic, yes.
Let's say we have a mass extinction in 1,000 years, and looking in the back and like looking past, we always are developing different species. I mean, is there a possibility someone so that will actually be like a superhuman kind of species that we will evolve to?
In case you didn't hear that, there's a question about if we have a mass extinction event, could humans evolve to a superhuman new species? I think, the evidence I cited from the geologic record is such that, as I said, the more complex life forms tend to be the ones that become extinct. So our chances are reduced by that observation, if that observation holds true for the mass extinction we appear to be driving. So anything is possible for those of you who believe in evolution. I hope most people think that it's a viable hypothesis. And you know, who knows, that could happen, but the likelihood, I think, is less after a mass extinction event. In the geological record, it's really interesting. You look at the plankton, like foraminifera, radiolaria, diatoms, and when there's a mass extinction event, you see the sudden disappearance of all these really complex and ornate plankton. And what comes back after the mass extinction event is really simple, spherical plankton. And I think that sort of observation is true for the whole tree of life. That, you know, the simple stuff survives, the stuff that reproduces really quickly, the stuff that can mutate really quickly. We don't, you know, we're not in that category. Well, some of us are. Yeah. Present company excluded. Yes.
You know, there's the eruption of, say, Yellowstone, has the potential to be like this
The question is whether Yellowstone has the potential to do the sort of damage to cause a mass extinction. It's believed that Yellowstone started as to create as a volcano about 15 million years ago, forming something called the Columbia River basalts in Washington and Oregon. And the North American plate has been moving over that hot spot, and you can trace the track of that volcano from Washington and Oregon through the Snake River Plain to Yellowstone right now. There was no mass extinction associated with this big eruption 15 million years ago, and there's no suggestion that there'll be another eruption of that scale thanks to Yellowstone. It's not to say Yellowstone couldn't do a lot of local damage, because the last big Yellowstone eruption was several 100,000 years ago, and it threw material up into the atmosphere, some of which landed as far east as Pennsylvania. So it does throw a lot of stuff out. It's a very explosive kind of eruption, but earth-changing, probably not. Yes?
As a geophysicist, can you talk about the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles and how things are changing, and also the budget and how we don't know where a large reservoir of nitrogen is, and we know?
I wish I could, but as a geophysicist, I know nothing about nitrogen and phosphorus cycles.
Yeah, sorry.
Maybe someone in the audience knows something about those. Sorry. I can point you in the right direction to people who do know, so I'll talk to you later. Yes?
What efforts are being made to bring this information to the general population internationally and in a way that will be understood by large populations?
I don't think there's any concerted efforts. The IUCN, which I mentioned, is sort of the international body that looks after these things, and they put those categories: endangered, critically endangered. But how they get the message out is up to the international organization, and we know how effective the United Nations is getting this sort of information out. So international organizations are challenged this way. I mean, the reason I gave a TED Talk on this was to try and get the message to a broader audience, but I can say it hasn't been all that successful from my perspective. And I hear about these things at professional meetings. We talk about them as professional scientists, but I would say that public penetration has been very small. So this is part of the public outreach. Yes, in the back?
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing the difficult to hear news that's, I think, comes as no surprise, I can say to these people in here. And it's interesting to me that we're in a facility that is studying aging to help humans live here longer. And I want to thank you even more for bringing up the topic of population control or birth control. In my world, in my circle of friends, people don't talk about that, and they think I'm nuts, and I feel like I'm totally alone in that, and to me, that's something we can do. So my question, is, and I would like to ask this of anyone, everyone, every scientist, the question is, why don't we change?
I think everyone in this room probably has as good an answer as I might have on that. Yes, thank you for that comment.
Science progresses, and you've developed a bit of a model here, which is much more complex than perhaps most of us know. And the same thing is happening in attempts to understand the nature of disease and distribution of disease around the world. How do you expect to be able to get this information, which involves juggling multivariate systems, across to people who are not trained to deal with multivariate systems?
It's, as you point, the question is, how do we get this information to a broader audience? And that is extremely challenging. I mean, I've spent the bulk of my career working on research ships and writing scientific papers and talking at scientific conferences. I've done very little outreach to the public. I've started more in the last 5 to 10 years, but as I've moved into more management positions at the various labs I've worked at. But yeah, it's a huge challenge. I think scientific literacy in this country is decreased since I was in high school. It's sorry. I have an anecdote about Lamar Smith, who's chair of the U.S. House of Representatives Science Panel. He's been on a vendetta against geoscience because, well, he says that geoscience or earth science isn't real science. And so he wanted to cut funding at the National Science Foundation for geoscience, as well as social science, hugely. He wasn't successful, but he met with a friend of mine in Texas a few months ago. And after sort of a group discussion with all of his aides and staffers, he asked my friend if he could talk with him one-on-one. And I guess all of the aides were aghast that this chair of the House Science Panel would want to talk with a scientist one-on-one. But they went into the room, and what his main question was, he said, why are universities charging overhead on grants? He said, they shouldn't be charging overhead at all. We just should give the money to the scientists, and they should do the work, and universities can fend for themselves and research agencies. And so my friend, I thought his answer was really good. He said, well, if you went to start a small business on Main Street, you'd have to pay rent, you'd have to pay insurance, you'd have to pay your staff, you'd have to There's a lot of costs that are involved in running any sort of enterprise. And universities are no different. And so and I don't know whether he actually got through to Lamar Smith or not, but that just shows this person is in charge of the House science budget. And he does not have that fundamental understanding of what science involves, budgetarily, let alone scientifically. So, I think we need more politicians who have science knowledge. We need to do more outreach with politicians. Although most of the times I met with politicians, you usually meet with their staffers or their aides. You don't actually meet with the senator or the representative.
Mike?
Yes,
As an
Rob.
ongoing optimist and brother-in-law, what are three things that we as individuals might do? We can't stop this, obviously, but just so that we say, okay, we're participating in some way other than not producing more children.
Well, you saw what they're critically endangered. The question is, what can we do as individuals to help address this issue? You saw from the circle there, the environmental stressors, that the real danger zone ones are biodiversity and the phosphorus and nitrogen cycle. So that and population, limiting population growth, I think are the three main areas we could work with. So when you make your donations to charities, when you think about where you want to allocate your energy and your life outside of work, think about those three areas and what you might be able to do to contribute to addressing the problems that are stressing the entire planet.